It was only a matter of time for the topic of race to come up on Personalist Manifestos. And when the time came, I wanted to have a conversation with someone who approaches the topic with a critical and constructive perspective, a prophetic and pastoral voice. Enter Grace Ji-sun Kim, who consistently offers such a perspective and voice in her work, and made some time in her busy schedule to speak with me recently. People familiar with Ellul will be aware that despite the wide range of topics he engages in his work, discussions of race rarely appear, and when they do, he seems to be more skeptical, if not resistant to these discussions, than he is curious and affirming. For example, when he mentions the Latin American and Black liberation theologies emerging in his time, he wavers between support, caution, and critique. And then there's a chapter in Subversion of Christianity and a posthumously published book on Islam showing Ellul being quite brutal in his treatments of Islam. Mentioning this, I'm reminded of an exchange with a scholar at a religious studies and technology conference I attended a number of years ago. This was when I was still living in the UK. The scholar was Muslim, and as we talked about our mutual scholarly interests, Ellul's name came up. "Oh," the scholar said, "I don't read Ellul." "Why not?" I asked. "Because of what he said about Islam," the scholar replied. After a few moments of silence, all I could say was something to the effect of, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I really don't know what to do with that part of his work. I really struggle with it." To this day, I don't know what to do with these facets of Ellul's work. I read them, I try to understand why he might be saying what he is saying and the way he is saying it, but I continually come up short. The most charitable interpretation I can have is as follows. After what he witnessed during the First and Second World Wars, he was terrified of further nationalist and racial division in and beyond Europe. So he sought to silence anything or anyone that could provoke more division and violence. But even if this is an accurate reading, is this the best way to go about resisting division and violence? Honestly, I don't think so. For this reason, I'm left with a glaring contradiction in Ellul's life and work to wrestle with. He stood up for justice in word and deed throughout his life, from his participation in the French resistance, to his work with disenfranchised youth, to environmental activism, and so much more. But in certain parts of his writing, his voice can come across as overly harsh, if not prejudiced, towards apparently like-minded people who are similarly struggling for justice and freedom to have faith in an all too often faithless world, even if the expression of faith differs from his own. I suppose the best thing to do is continue wrestling with the contradiction, to create space about difficult topics like these in and beyond Ellul's work, and when warranted, go beyond it to speak critically and constructively, prophetically and pastorally about things that demand our discussion and action. And so here we are, my conversation with Grace Ji-sun Kim about her latest book, When God Became White. Our conversation is not as long as other Personalist Manifesto dialogues because Grace's time and perspective is in high demand these days. In fact, before we hit record, she mentioned she had done 3 interviews before she met with me. But what we lacked in time, we gained in a straight-to-the-point conversation about the kinds of work Grace and many other scholars like her are trying to do these days. I can't promise this will be easy listening, especially if you're inclined to dismiss or try to shut down discussions and uses of intersectional and critical race theory. But I will urge you to keep listening even when it's difficult. Because if you do keep listening, you might discover, just as I'm discovering, that the categories of white and whiteness are not directed at white people per se. Rather, they're directed at ideologies and systems and actions that continue to put white people in positions of power, and by extension, exclude, oppress, and hurt people who are not. The good news is that, on the other side of this discovery, is the realization that there's only one race, the human race, and the different groups comprising this race are fearfully and wonderfully made by a triune God who, in this God's very being and action, is at once unified and plural, and because of this, started and is finishing creation with a move towards similar unity and plurality. And so with that, here's my conversation with Grace. All right. So, welcome to you. Let's start really simply as we always do, Dr. Kim. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So great to be on your podcast. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm a professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion and, authored several books. And I'm glad to be here today to speak about when God became white. I am ordained Presbyterian Church USA. So I grew up in Canada. So I was part of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And then when we moved to the US, I became ordained PCUSA. And I also host a podcast, Madang, hosted by the Christian Century. So I hope some of your listeners will also listen to my podcast, Madang.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things is putting Easter eggs in all of the show notes. So that will definitely find its way into the show notes as well.
Oh,
I
that's
feel
great.
like several books is an understatement. I feel like a lot of books is another, which is kind of like, yeah, is a major accomplishment. So yeah,
Thank you
thank
so
you for
much.
yeah. So thank you for telling, yeah, just taking the time to talk to us about your latest book. And before we get into the specifics of that book, could you start a little bit more broadly telling us about your interests theologically speaking?
So I graduated, I think it was 2001. So it's been almost 25 years. And I think my interest in theology has like slightly changed over the years. I was really interested in feminist theology, and I still am. And so some of my work will intersect with feminist work and work on social justice. So I think just a thread that runs through my own work in the last 25 years would be that theology is not something that is just what you do with your head. It really is something that moves us to do something in the world that will fit in line with the gospel message, which is of justice, working for the marginalized and the oppressed, speaking up for the voiceless people. And also, justice is not just centered on human beings, but of all of God's creation. So, my forthcoming book this August will be called Earthbound, which is on climate justice and God. So, much of my work is centered on how can we live more justly as Christians or as spiritual beings that will fit in the gospel message of Jesus. So, that's kind of my theological focus and much of my writings.
Yeah, well, you have written on intersectionality in
Yes.
your published work, and obviously spoken about it a lot. And it does strike me that you can enter the sort of stream, as it were, with a particular focus, in your case, feminist theology. But once you start looking at that particular group, which often is pushed to the side or made invisible, which is another one of your themes in your work,
Yeah.
is it actually starts to intersect with other groups who there's some commonalities, but also some distinctions as well in terms of the effects of being made invisible and pushed to the side and so forth. And I've experienced that myself in areas of like disability that you enter a conversation with disability, but once you start having that conversation, it starts bringing you into contact with other intersecting factors. And it makes a lot of sense that, you would be getting into the environment as well, because now that's looking at the space in which all of this is happening. So your latest publication, though, is dealing with race,
Uh-huh.
and the title is When God Became White. So what prompted you? I mean, having just given all that preamble, I feel like it's setting you up here, but what prompted you to write this book?
So you're in Canada, and I grew up in Canada. So
Mhm.
I was born in Korea, immigrated to Canada in the 1970s. And back then, people didn't know much about Asia or Koreans in general. So there was a lot of racism growing up and, going to school. So within the school and society. So it was really, really hard. But, about 50 years have passed, and, many people listen to K-pop and watch K-drama. The Korean movie Parasite won the Oscars a few years back. So there's a lot of influence from Asia. We have mukbang, which is what people, watching people eat. That started in Korea. So, with a lot of, with the globalization, people know how diverse everyone is. People know who Koreans are, but there's still so much racism towards us and just racism in general. So I didn't understand why that was happening. 50 years ago, I understand because people, well, not understand, but the reason is they haven't heard about who Koreans were or didn't know Asians, so they just started making fun of us. But now that the world has become smaller and everything's at our fingertips, why is this continuing to happen? So that's what led me to write this book. As you mentioned earlier about intersectionality, I wrote intersectional theology and how all these aspects of injustice intersect to continue to oppress. So the book, I wanted to write a book to help me understand why there is so much oppression and racism and also sexism. And, you know, it all ties in with how we understand who God is. So, writing the book really helped me, and I hope that it will help many people. The book has been out for about, I don't know, 8 or 9 months, and lots of people are using it already in the classroom and in the churches, which I'm really grateful for because that's what I had in mind. The book has discussion questions after each chapter. So I'm really hoping that people will read it together and discuss it and have good, fruitful discussions and move forward on how to dismantle racism or any form of injustice so that we can build a more just world in which we
Mm. Yeah, thank you. One of the pop culture uh shows that I was hoping maybe actually to get your thoughts on was have you seen the TV show Beef?
live. No, I should, but I haven't watched it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested. So after you watch it, if you
Uh-huh,
get around to watching it,
uh-huh,
I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. So the school that I work at has a lot of Korean language programming, as you know. So a good majority of the faculty here are Korean speaking, 1.5 generation and so on.
uh-huh.
And one of my colleagues said, Michael, you need to watch this show. It
Okay.
really captures the Asian American experience and the pressures and these sorts of things. But um, yeah, we'll have to have a conversation another
Okay,
time
we'll do
about
that
that.
another time
But
after I watch it then.
it is
Yeah.
interesting though, because
Uh-huh,
like you said, it's one thing to enter popular consciousness. It's another thing to be received how you would like to be received versus like a sort of caricaturized version of yourself. And one of the lines from the show that my colleague and I bonded over was there's this one character who's talking about Italians and Koreans, and he says we get along because it's peninsula mentality. And so on my father's side of the family, they immigrated from Southeast Italy when he was one.
uh-huh,
And
uh-huh,
actually, the more that I've journeyed with my Korean colleagues, there's a lot of
uh-huh.
similarities.
Yeah.
But the way in which Italian culture has been sort of received now as honorary Canadians, but
Uh-huh.
originally that was not so coming out of the
Um,
Second World War and that
uh-huh,
sort of thing. And of course, how often the assumption is that, Italians are just loud, passionate, and like pasta. And there's more depth there
uh-huh. Yeah.
than just that,
Uh-huh.
or, the Godfather trilogy and all the great mafia films, right? So, how
Yeah.
do you get past the sort of pop culture reception into a depth of human experience that goes beyond just all of these limiting notions, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's why I have such a very basic name, Michael, because growing up with a dad named Claudio, everybody got his name
Um,
wrong as either Mario or
uh,
Claudia. So he said,
oh,
I'm
okay.
tired of having, people mess up my Italian name. I'm not going to curse my children with an Italian name. It's just David, Peter, Michael. Very
Oh,
basic,
okay.
biblical. Can't mess that up. Okay, so your book, When God Became White, you're dealing with the concept of white and whiteness. And for those who are unfamiliar with how these concepts are working their way out in your work, can you describe what is meant by them? Um, I've experienced people, especially white folks, who get very uneasy with these kinds of works. And I think the reason for that is they're interpreting use of the terms whiteness as being directed specifically at white people. But if I'm reading you right and others who are working within this territory, that's not exactly what you're getting at. So can you share a little bit about how these terms white and whiteness are at work in your writing?
Yeah, so I hope many of your listeners will read the book because I go into depth about white and how the creation of white people came to be as a term. It's not a term that has always been with us, it's a more recent term. And this concept of whiteness, it's a constructed term just like what race is. People think these are like biological terms, but they're not. These are all constructed terms, and it is used by people to help understand different ethnicities, different groups of people, but it's nothing biological. For example, during World War II, the Germans thought that they were the best race. And they would, and not just them, people in history would try to measure people's brains and say, okay, Black people's brains are smaller, or Asian people's, something is worse. So they would try to do this biologically that, one group of people are better than others. We're all human beings, and that's something that we should really just try to embrace rather than saying, the Aryan race is the best race and therefore you can get rid of the Jewish people because they are horrible people. Their brain size may be smaller, or you can pick anything. But the notion of race is not a biological term. It's constructed, and even the construct of white people and Black people, yellow people. I don't wake up. Asians don't wake up and say, "Oh, we're all yellow people." We're called yellow people. So these are terms that people should be aware are used either to keep their power or to oppress other people. So whiteness is another constructed term to kind of explain or describe what is happening. And it allows white supremacy to exist. It allows racism to exist, and it tries to maintain the status quo. So that's what whiteness tries to do. And, when we're talking about, like, when I have a male theologian friend who says, when he wants to get rid of patriarchy, but he's born a man, so he is always aware of it, and so he has to work harder to fight patriarchy. So when women are doing, feminist theology, it's not to hate men, it's to hate the construct of patriarchy. I have two boys, I have a husband. Feminist theologians don't hate men. It's the construct of patriarchy that we want to dismantle. So I think, when just as you were saying, oh, white people can get a little uncomfortable or they misunderstand, when we're using the concept of whiteness and trying to dismantle it, none of us are saying white people are bad. It's the construct that continues to oppress people of color. So I think people need to understand the differences and differentiate it and be aware that there are these social constructs to oppress and marginalize and make certain groups invisible. And
Hmm.
that's what I want to fight against in this book and many of my previous books. So, that's kind of my theological journey, that it is all these injustices get intertwined with Christianity, and then Christianity perpetuates them or allows all of this to happen. And that's why it's become a big problem. So I'm really glad that there are a lot of Korean students at your seminary. And, I'm hoping that everyone feels welcome, because it's the diversity that makes everything so rich, whether it be your church or seminary or workplace. It's diversity that really helps creativity and helps us even to get a deeper understanding of who God is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the arc of scripture, I mean, um, there's the hidden in reality, plain sight reality that there's only one race, the human race.
Okay.
And they're
Yeah.
right, like,
And
Adam
we're
and
all
Eve.
human beings. I know. Yeah.
Right. But there's seemingly infinite variability within that race. So yeah, there's cultures, there's ethnicities, right? There's
Yeah.
particularities to people that are embedded within particular context. But it's
Yeah.
not as if what you're saying, in terms of whiteness as a category is kind of this that sort of throws into more, discrete parts as sort of, okay, well, this group, this group, this group, this group,
Uh-huh.
and it's almost like a rubric through which to see the world and people. And
Yeah.
and of course, there's a group that is viewed as sort of normative in the assessment for all the others. Um, and yet, Scripture comes with a much more basic, but also uh, liberating word that actually one human race, we're all made from the dirt of the ground
Yeah.
and brought to life with the breath of God. And we are going towards an eschaton, and that eschaton is coming to us with, lo and behold, all those people coming in together to celebrate God.
Uh-huh.
But I think, you talk about this in terms of, more critical treatments of race and theology and other disciplines, but also within feminism too. I think it goes back to the caricaturization effect, right? That if we can say that, anybody, working on scholarship such as yourself, oh, well, if they just don't like white people, so right, or all feminists hate men, then we don't have to listen to them, right? And they're hostile. But actually, what if we just took down the defensive posture and listened
Uh-huh.
and created? And I can tell people, feminists don't hate men because I'm part of a feminist theology network, and they're really nice,
Yeah.
and I learn lots. And
Yeah.
shout out
Uh-huh.
to them, actually, Feminist Theology Network.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like so. Just approach with an open mind. More specifically, we can see not even just in theology, right, in the academy, but like in mainstream discourse and politics and such, there has been a real strong pushback against critical race theory, intersectionality, and so on. And so, from your perspective, if someone is coming to you and saying, "Hey, I have misgivings about this. I don't think our kids should be reading this, let alone I don't think we should be teaching these things in our schools," like, how would you respond to them to sort of appeal to just say, like, there's value to this?
Well, there's so much value because how we it's important because this is human dynamics, and this is about human survival. Some people will say, well, racism, how bad can it be? Well, racism is bad. It's evil. And I think the church needs to kind of describe it as sin, because racism leads to death. Racism has caused genocide. Racism has caused wars. It has caused colonialism and subjugation. There is so much problem with racism, and once we are able to name these evils that it causes, that, it caused the crusade, it caused so much damage to other people. Once we are able to name it as dangerous and as evil and sinful, if you're going to go into the church, then we should try our best to eliminate and dismantle racism. So I think it's so important to study it in our schools and in our churches and understand how that is also connected to our notion of a white male God.
Mm.
No one has seen God, but for some reason, whether you're Christian or not, they imagine God to be a white male in the Western Hemisphere, when, among Christian nations, if you want to call it that. So it's problematic because if none of us have seen God, how are we so certain that God is male and God is white? But it has served the purpose of white Europeans for the last 2,000 years under the Roman Empire and to other empires after that, because it allowed them to then colonize Arabs or those with darker skin, go into Africa, go into other parts of Europe and Middle East, and you can even have a crusade against Muslims because they are dark skinned. You have a white God to back you up. And that's why, Jesus being born a Palestinian Jew is most likely dark skinned. Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt.
Mhm.
Egyptians are dark skinned. If
Mhm.
Jesus wasn't dark skinned, he would have stood out.
Mhm.
But, being darker skin, but you can't have, so under the Roman Empire, you can't have a god with dark skin because you are actually expanding your empire and colonizing those with dark skin.
Mhm.
So understanding how this works makes us realize how dangerous this is, how dangerous racism is, and if you connect it to God and preach a white male God. It is basically saying God is allowing white supremacy to exist. You're weaponizing God, you're weaponizing the Bible. So it is a very, very dangerous thing that has been happening for the last 2,000 years. And so we really have to question this and question the whiteness and the maleness of God. Because if no one has seen God, and of course, I end the book with different ways of thinking about God and reimagining God. I'm not drawing them out of thin air. I don't do theology out of thin air and just make things up. It's biblical. There are
Mhm.
other biblical ways of thinking about God and talking about God.
Mhm.
These have been ignored or buried because theology has been so patriarchal. Of course, the men aren't going to focus on it. It
Mhm.
takes 2,000 years when finally some few women theologians are there to work on things like this and understand the importance of retrieving some of these images and languages and traditions that were around 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, and you in the end of your book you talk about what if we started to emphasize God as spirit, and you get into themes of Chi and Sophia, Shekinah, and so forth. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then I have a follow-up question about the incarnation and the context boundedness of this, and I want to talk about that too, but I also want to give space to the emphasis, the attributes of God that don't often get attention first. So do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll just share a little bit because if the listeners are interested, they can just go and get the
Sure,
whole book.
absolutely.
Yeah, so the Old Testament and New Testament are full of images of who God is.
Hmm.
And I think people sitting in the pews get metaphors mixed up. They believe that metaphors are something, but metaphors are pointing to something. It's not an equal thing. So the church so far has been using the patriarchal ones that we're all familiar with. We use it Sunday and in our prayers, which is like God as King and Lord and Master. So we then believe, okay, God is a master. And we use that metaphor to enslave other people. And we use language, and it's in the New Testament too, slaves obey your master. not understanding the context that that was written in. And we will use king. So king is this authoritarian person that can go and invade and conquer and kill. It's a horrific image. Um, when the kings had all that authority. Today they're more like symbols, but it's not a good image, but we believe then God is like that. So if you're going to invade as an emperor, that's okay because God does that. You know, God is king or God is emperor. So we don't understand that it only points, it gives a dimension of God. But people sitting in the pews think it's actually God, God as king and God as master. So I think understanding how metaphors work is an important step towards understanding the biblical words and languages and images and metaphors. So the book kind of explores these other metaphors and images and language that is present in the Old Testament and New Testament. So just to share one on your podcast is wisdom. So Old Testament is written in Hebrew, New Testament in Greek. So the Hebrew word is Hakma and the Greek word is Sophia. And both of these words are feminine. I think Sophia is more clear because we use Sophia for girls' names. So Sophia we understand to be feminine, but Hakma is also feminine. And when these terms are used in the Bible, Hakma in the book of Proverbs or in other books throughout the Old Testament, it is often associated with a woman as or the phrase Lady Wisdom. So you'll see that in Proverbs, where Lady Wisdom sets a table and welcomes all the people to the table. And there's other images that are feminine associated with Hakma and Sophia. That has been part of our biblical tradition. And and parts of the early church too. So when you think about Hagia Sophia, the church in Istanbul, it's no longer a church because they've been fighting over that building for so long, but it is called Hagia Sophia, which means Holy Sophia. So the language of wisdom, the concept of Sophia has been around for a long time. But with patriarchy and male theologians, church fathers, reformers all being men, the Enlightenment thinkers, even majority of the present day theologians are men. So they don't retrieve some of these feminine words, metaphors, and images of God. But I think it's time to do that because this patriarchal understanding of God has been used to go into war, to colonize, to destroy the earth and destroy people. If an image is damaging, we have to sit back and say, is this the only way to think about God? Is this the way that emperors wanted? Of course. They
Mhm.
were out there to colonize and destroy and murder and take over the land. But understanding our history will then help us to say, let us now look at other ways of talking about God and imaging God and using different metaphors. Because racism, if it's this constant white male God, as I shared earlier, will lead to destruction of human beings and of the earth. So I'm really hoping that Christians will rethink and reimagine who God is. And
Mhm.
hopefully that will lead us to a more flourishing earth and a better loving community of human beings.
Yeah, I one of my uh well, he was my PhD supervisor. Now he's a friend, and he talks about it as, when you happen to be a white male theologian, what does it look like to pull at the threads of patriarchy,
Um,
right? Because it's like you don't choose how you're born into the world, and but for those of us who work and write from the perspective like I do, what does it mean to take into account different images, different language that start to awaken you to one, the breadth and depth of God, but also uh, how those different images play out, not just individually, but structurally. What does the incarnation get you? Because that was one question that I had for you coming out of your book, because um, when God chooses to elect Israel as God's chosen people, it's a very unlikely choice, first of all. Right? It's not Egypt, it's not like Assyria, it's not Persian, it's not Greece, it's not Rome, like all the heavy hitters, right? It's this very unique group. Um, and then of course the incarnation, it happens in a place where one person like, can anything good come out of there? And so how does God's, choice to enter into covenant with Israel, and then of course to take on flesh in the form of Jesus, who is male, and who does, there's king language, but I think about his words: "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." And before we jump, so then okay, king language is all right. Like let's be okay, but like, how does the incarnation actually resist the types of interpretations and applications you're talking about, like colonialism,
Yeah. So maybe
exploitation, and
we'll,
kingship,
yeah.
right? How does that uh, help a project like yours and those like it?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. But to close this interview, I'll just say briefly, I look at the Bible as uh, kind of a confession of faith, in the sense that these Israelites, it's a story of their journey of a relationship with God. So I don't think that's the only uh, group of people. God is in covenant with all of humanity, with all of God's creation. So, I think sometimes thinking that one group is chosen can lead to kind of dangerous theology and a destructive theology. But if you're approaching the Bible, these Israelites who were struggling with sin, with war, with invasion, and being colonized and being exiled, you get a deeper understanding of this love of God who is with God's people. So one group of people. So I view it that way,
Mhm.
and that through the incarnation, we get a deeper understanding of God, which should not limit and say, oh, see, Jesus used Abba language to address God, but understanding that it's a relational relationship. The early church, was confused about who Jesus is. So, looking at all the council meetings and the heresies, you get a deeper understanding that the church was torn. They didn't know the fullness of Jesus. Even the 12 disciples were confused, and that's very evident in the gospel readings. So, the incarnation of Jesus has been misunderstood, but the church has decided, okay, we're going to have a Trinitarian theology where it is God, the Creator, Jesus, the Redeemer, and the Spirit, the the Sustainer. What is it? Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. So when we look at the Trinitarian God, I don't think we should always just focus on Jesus. I think, much of my work is on the Spirit. So people will say the first 2,000 years of Christianity will be Christocentric, the next 2,000 will be Spirit-centered. I don't know if it will be, but I think understanding this Trinitarian view of God will then help us to move away from the maleness.
Mhm.
Because if we're going to use the spirit language, the spirit was first kind of a neuter noun. then it became feminine, and then it was understood as masculine. But I think presently it's more of a neuter understanding of God, who God is. So if we're going to do the Trinitarian, not just to focus on the incarnation through Jesus, but the whole three Godhead, then we get a fuller and a deeper understanding of God, a God that we will never come to fully understand because God is infinite and we're finite. And I think that will then lead us to say the mystery of God, even through the incarnation, is a mystery. We will never understand the full incarnation and the fullness of God. And once people in the church approach it that way, I think we become freer. We can then move past all these, uh, you know, these debates with language and the wording, and really be open and being open to the other images and languages about who God is.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if Paul didn't write Romans 11 talking about a tree that was the natural tree and then the wild branches being grafted in. But whether you're the sort of natural branch or the wild branch, be careful,
Yeah.
right? And
Uh-huh.
it's almost as if the wild branches now think that they're the natural branches, but either way. And then,
Yeah.
of course, what does it mean for Jesus to say it's better for you that I'm going because I'm sending one to you? Right.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm getting from what you're saying. And it was just a curiosity to hear you speak to that. And I think that's a great place to end. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your perspective. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy.
You bet.
Thank you.
Take care.